of finding and striking that right balance between being reactive and then leaning into that core of this is who we are, this is what we believe in, and this is what we're committed to.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Hold On, Let Me Close My Door. I'm Allison DeFlorio, co-founder and managing partner of Exude Human Capital, and I'm so thrilled to have with me today Shannon Lucas of the Mother Cabrini Health Foundation based in New York City. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you, Allison. I'm excited to be here.
You know, Shannon, I met you, 4 or 5 years ago? And at that time, Mother Cabrini was just forming. You were a brand new entity, and you were probably hire number 2 in that organization. And as we start winding down 2023, I thought it would be wonderful for our listeners to do a little bit of reflection through your eyes, reflecting and looking back on what it was like to start an organization and looking forward as to what the next steps are. But before we get into that, I would love for you to share a bit about your background and how you got into your role as Chief Administrative Officer with Mother Cabrini Health Foundation.
Yeah, and luckily those worlds kind of collide together, so I'm happy to do that. Yes, I'm Shannon Lucas, Chief Administrative Officer at the Mother Cabrini Health Foundation, and we opened our doors at the end of 2018. But prior to that, I was a Vice Chancellor at the Archdiocese of New York, and had spent 12 plus years at the Archdiocese in various seats, started in development as a fundraiser, and then ended up working directly with our Chancellor and the Cardinal himself. So Cabrini comes from the sale of Fidelis Care, which was a Medicaid managed insurance program. The 8 bishops of New York State and a lay board ran this insurance company and decided to sell it. And my current CEO, Monsignor Greg, who you may hear me mention, was in charge of that sale and decided after the sale and a rigorous vetting process throughout New York State, the proceeds turned into a private foundation. And we are focused on healthcare and the social determinants of health. So when Monsignor decided, I have an interest in maybe being the CEO, he talked to the board of directors that was put into place and the Cardinal, and he asked me would I come along with him. And Allison was one of the first people I met that made me feel like, okay, this is a real thing, because we had to hire people, we had to have benefits, we had to have titles and a payroll and all of the things that, you take for granted when you started a new job. We had to put those in place. So it's been quite a ride. And yeah, it's been 5 years.
Yeah, that's hard to believe. And I do remember our very first phone call. And I think one of the things that struck me about your focus in this role, knowing that we had a very short period of time to actually start getting things set up, was your focus on people and being very thoughtful about bringing people in and planning for new hires and things like that. So here's what I'd love for you to think about. If can you walk us through that 5-year journey? When you think of year 1, that first phone call that we had, what's one word that comes to mind that would describe that year, and then walk us through the journey?
Well, I want to say chaos for the phone call, because the phone call was chaos. But I think the first year felt really brisk. And I mean that in that it was fast paced. There was a lot going on. There were new hires. And those hires were other executives, right? So the CEO was number 1. I was number 2. But as you think through all these other moving parts, I've got a lot of strong personalities coming in who are building their own teams. And so it was a lot of blocking and tackling and moving fast. I wouldn't say cold in that brisk word, but it felt, quick. Like we had a lot to get going in year 1. And one thing, if I could change that again, I wish that we could have spent more time as executives kind of getting to know each other across the departments there. Having said that, I think we now have a great relationship. I would have loved to have done that in year 1. And then year 2, 2020 was a year of pandemic. So that
impact, because you were in the heart of New York City, you were living this, your your foundation gives money to health or to support health and families in the city and in the state. How did that impact you?
It very quickly and a lot. So I remember when the National Guard went into New Rochelle, our CFO was in my office saying, "This is crazy. Are you seeing this?" And we were interviewing our first round of program officers that day. And I had to get up and leave because, there's a round table of other foundation COOs, and we were all trying to figure out what was going on and what we needed to do to provide for our people and to get everybody safely, in a space where we could still operate. But we had no idea, I mean, no one did, of what was happening in the world. So New York was tough. We went home around the same time as everyone, early March. And the nice thing about Cabrini, unrelated to the pandemic, we had already decided to do everything cloud-based. Great IT hire in that first year. So she set everything up beautifully. So we were able to transition home quickly. But it really put a pause, Allison, on all of those big things that we just talked about, thinking about bringing on talent. I think we had maybe 10 employees at that time. And there were plans to start really fleshing out each department. And that year, 2020, was a lot of stop and go. Should we hire people via Zoom? What is a Zoom interview? Can you really tell who a person is via Zoom? I'm not comfortable interviewing people, but there was a lot of that back and forth. And should we wait? Well, this will be over in a month. Note, it was not over in a month. So we spent most of 2020 in that kind of start and stop when it came to bringing on talent. On the program side of the foundation, however, that was incredibly interesting. We knew that this was a global health crisis and that New York was being hit very hard. And so our CEO made a decision with our board of directors very quickly to, mobilize and put together some capital to get out the door for emergency COVID grants. And all in all, we did about 2 rounds of emergency grants for $70 million focused on PPE, hazard pay, and other needs that New York nonprofits had right in the moment. And for anyone who's ever worked with the foundation or applied for a grant, you probably know it's not easy always to mobilize and get that cash moving, especially given that we were just closing our first year and starting our own processes for grant review and application. And again, 10 people. So that was quite a feat. We were very proud of that. But 2020 was a lot.
That's, to me, it makes me feel stressed just hearing that and knowing that the whole reason your organization was formed was to do that, to be able to be there, not just for emergency situations, but to really help support the healthcare systems and families. And yet here you are also responsible for people who themselves are going through likely personal, potentially personal health issues or health issues with their families. And yet the drive to keep them moving forward. How did you balance the people needs, supporting the people, while still being able to drive the mission of the organization during that time?
Yeah, it's a great question. But the nice thing about that time and being a small staff is we were relatively small. We did the Zoom happy hours and meeting people for lunch over Zoom. But I have to say, our CEO, he would spend every week calling each employee, just checking in. How are you doing? What do you need? What's going on? Which was a great way to have that engagement. But a big concern he had, and that I shared, as a new organization, when you think about culture, how do you build culture when you're all sitting at home in your sweatpants and on Zoom all the time? The happy hours lasted for a few months, and then I think we all said, okay, enough of this. But that kind of takes me a little bit into 21, where there really started to feel a push of we've got to try to get some kind of in-person staff engagement, or have to try to think about ways that we can come together as we build culture and as we hire people. So if I can shift into 21, I think was a big energetic push that felt a little less stressful. There was a decision we were going to hire program officers. We had just put this infusion of cash into the state, and somebody's got to work with these organizations to make sure that, they have what they need, how else can they be helpful. So we hired that year I think the total was something like 30 people, 32, I think was the number.
It was a big dramatic change.
Yeah, it wasn't all programmed, but we brought in a community engagement team. We brought in our HR director. We were using outsourced HR through Exude, which was fabulous. But we felt with the pandemic, we needed somebody full time who was really to be helping us with all the legislation and thinking through what employees need and all the policies that came with welcoming folks back, because that was, doesn't feel like it was 10 years ago, but it was a.
Yeah. And there were quite a few changes with employment laws in New York City during that time, too. So that was an interesting evolution. You were one of the first groups that I work with that started bringing people back into the office. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, you're talking about culture and how do you keep that culture alive, especially with dramatic growth like you experienced. So can you talk a little bit about that?
I can, and I think I would be lying if I didn't tell you it was controversial with staff. We had a lot of conversations about this, and initially the plan was everyone come back for 1 day or 2 days a week. And this is, early 21. We don't have a vaccine yet, and we're cramped in tight quarters and wanted to be able to come to the office and work. So we made that first year was a voluntary welcome back to the office. And what we tried to do was incentivize it a bit. So folks who came in, I think we ended up giving them you had to come in a certain number of days and you got another week of vacation.
Oh, that's nice. I haven't heard that one.
Yeah, we were trying to think of ways to make it. And we also offered some stipends around transportation, because that was the big fear in New York, the subway. That you sit on a train with people and you didn't know what you were touching and everybody was gloved and masked, and of really trying to get people safely to and from. So we had folks who would take an Uber or take a taxi, or, we would offset some of that travel. And I think we did that for a period of, I want to say 3 to 6 months before we shifted, once there was a vaccine, to another controversial decision that I think many went through, of mandating the vaccine as a condition of employment. And then we started asking people to come back 1 day a week. You pick it. But we wanted to see everyone at some point. As people became more comfortable with that process, then it took a little bit more structure of how we started to think about, what teams are in on what days, who needs to work together, what's the value proposition of coming in, right? We talked about culture, but we don't want you coming in masked, gloved, plexiglass around your cubicle and not talking to anyone. You may as well stay home. So where and how are there meaningful ways for us to think about employees engaging with each other? And some of that, Allison, came around, and I'm not just saying this on the Exude podcast here, but around our shift into some strategic HR and thinking about core values, culture building, competencies. So everybody, again, had been blocking, tackling. The program team's getting grants out the door. The investment team is raising capital. The finance team is managing all of our cash flows and our texts. Because all of that's happening. But what is this organization as a whole? So we started to have some conversations with our HR consultant around that, and bringing the staff together, and had some really great conversations and discussions, because, again, we now have about 40 people as opposed to 10. So as those new humans come into place, they have needs, they have opinions, they come from other companies, they want to bring their unique talents and their unique culture into that space.
If you think back up until this point, right? So you've pulled and pushed a little bit, and people are getting comfortable and they're back in the office. What's the one greatest lesson you take from that period before we get into kind of this next phase?
I would say communication is important, but I also think it's important to be clear about who's making decisions. So a lot of conversations about surveying staff and asking people what they want and what they need. And I think that's important, but I also think sometimes when you ask that in a survey sense, people think they're voting, that this is the voting booth and I'm coming in and I lodged my vote in favor of work from home forever. And that's never really what we're asking. We're trying to take temperature, and we're trying to figure out a way that we can move what might be a no to a yes. I'm always trying to get to yes. and get to yes in a way where people are comfortable. So, we probably could be doing more surveys of employees. I should be doing it more than I do. But I do think that it made me a little gun shy in the energy surrounding that, if that makes sense, of people think, well, I said I didn't want to come back in. What is this new policy? It's not an every person decides. And I think that's the challenge of that position or that particular time of the year.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said. I'm a fan of surveys, but I'm also very cautious about over surveying, and I've seen that happen as well, not in your organization. So I think that your approach is really a solid one. I'm sure that there were things that you did along the way to, in a changing organization, growing organization, to build trust.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about kind of the challenges of culture in a virtual environment, but as you started bringing people back, what did you do to build trust across the board?
So yeah, I would say one thing, again, being new, Allison, is thinking about each department and the fact that we're saying you all are leaders as executives. We gave a lot of space for executives to work with their individual team members. If John has someone living in their home who is, has some immune system concerns, right? I'm okay with you making that decision and letting that person solve that. And I think that employees really got that there was flexibility, but we had to say the ship is going in this direction. There may be some exceptions, but not everything is an exception. I think sharing in some of that with the rest of the C-suite, and that we have a layer underneath of managing directors of also bringing those folks along with us, is that we're able to communicate decisions that have been made, but they've been made in a room where people can hear the thought process. There's a lot of transparent thought processes that go on, sometimes to the point of how much more do we need to talk about this? But we really do a lot of discussion around, especially that decision being a health foundation and asking people to come back. That was a tough one, but I think important because I really do think it did build culture. Otherwise, you already have, as I said, that first year before the pandemic hit, silos happening. And it was important to Monsignor Greg that he really start to break those down. So, yeah, I think that maybe that transparency helped establish trust.
You made me think of something that that I have observed and admired about your and the organization's leadership style, which is that investment in leadership. You just shared that you gave leaders the autonomy to make decisions about how to care for their departments, given the vision, within the vision of the organization. You as an organization have invested in leadership in order to help build that competency, because for some that needed to be built. It wasn't necessarily a given that it was there. Can you talk a little bit about why you made that investment, how that has impacted, and where you see your leaders today versus 3 years ago?
Yeah, and maybe I'll start with something that's important to me, and I can speak for our CEO too. You spend so much time with your colleagues that we always wanted work to feel like a place that you didn't, begrudgingly walk out your door and come into, oh, I have to go to Cabrini again. And so part of that is, how do we engage with each other and how do we treat each other in a way that values everybody's opinion, but also allows us to have healthy conflict and keep moving forward. Sometimes you don't get to that, how do you keep moving forward piece of conflict. So each of our executives has an executive coach. And part of that decision was, it gets lonely in those seats. And when you want to think about, reflect on something that happened this week or last week, or you have questions about, I could use some advice on this choice or that choice. Sometimes it's not appropriate to do that with your own team or even with your manager, the CEO. So we wanted to give people space because this is all new. And we know each other, but we don't know each other. Of how can we think about having that sounding board to help us optimize our performance as executives and to help us focus. I'll speak for myself with my coach. Sometimes, there's so much flying at you that where she is incredibly helpful is she helps me focus on what are goals for both the administration department, but also Shannon as an executive. How do I be the best person who shows up for my team and for the foundation? And we loved this process so much that we added executive coaching to that next layer. So our managing directors all now have both group coaching. We wanted again to encourage the breaking down of some of the silos. And then they also have some time one-to-one to think about developing them as leaders. I always say the mechanics of your job, we hired really bright and really great people and they come with that skill set. But I think the muscle we need to practice in a new organization is thinking about how we do that together. So, I always joke with my CFO when we first met it. He said, I'm trying to think of how to say this politely. And I said, don't, just say it. So we come back to often, I just say something, we'll clean it up later, but let's just say it so we can all move and speak the same language and not worry so much about the politics of, am I opining? Well, I would never opine on an investment decision, but think about, how can we be respectful of each other's spaces and add to their department rather than distract or cause friction.
And that's something that I've observed even in the meetings that I've had the pleasure of sitting in on, where you have that, you use the phrase healthy conflict, but being able to listen without judgment, to hear what people say, maybe not necessarily make a decision about anything at that moment in time, but agree to come back together after people have had time to think about it and make a decision. You've also included that next layer of leadership in some of these major decisions. As you look forward, as you look to, okay, we're just about to wrap up 2023. We're going into 2024 now. Where do you see your focus? Where do you see your focus for leaders, for supporting staff, for you yourself as the leader in the organization? What's next?
Yeah, I want to go back to something you said earlier, which is it felt kind of stressful thinking about those first couple of years. Our chief program officer in year 1 and 2 used to say we were drinking from a fire hose. I want to turn the pressure down on that fire hose a little bit and start to shift to things that feel a bit more intentional. 5 years in, we're talking a little bit about what a proper strategic plan would look like. It's very hard to do a strategic plan when you're pivoting through a pandemic or there's something new every day and you're hiring staff. We now have a good sense of our team, of the culture together. We went through a core values exercise. I think coming next are going to be a few things thinking about how this foundation leaves its imprint on New York State. We're bound to New York State, right? So how can we think about the lives that we change throughout the state? And how can we also think a little bit about the legacy we leave for the next leaders at Cabrini? Because, hopefully we'll continue to grow and do more. But even smaller discussions, Allison, you were with us as we went through our core values exercise. How do we live those values? We don't want to just sit in a room and ideate. And by the way, it was a great day of ideating and having conversations about different values. But how do those show up so that they don't just end up, they're not actually on the wall. There's a plan to put them on the wall. But how do we lean into those values? How do we lean into our core competencies? That these things that we're investing in from a strategic space have to yield some return. So that's the big picture of where we're going. I think in a smaller level, there are some organizational pieces we still need to do. To your point on trust, I think that conversation about how we think about compensation and performance management and promotions and career pathing. And, again, every executive has done it differently from where they came from. And how do we take the good, but make it fit into what will be Cabrini's way of doing this? So that's a piece that's coming down the pipeline. And again, the big one, thinking a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion at the foundation. We work in a space of health equity. We should be thinking about and talking about racial equity and health equity. The pandemic is a great example of that. Black and brown communities impacted in a way that was much larger, especially in New York. Anybody in the social determinants of health space is not surprised by that when you think about outcomes and where you live, and your zip code determines your outcomes. So more to come in that space, and entry points of how we bring DEI from an HR space, from a purchasing space, from a programmatic space, of having a framework that makes sense for us across the board is going to be an exciting, and that's the kind of stuff that I love, the building and the talking, and bringing everybody along together. Because I could write a framework tomorrow, but I want to write a framework that makes sense for Cabrini.
And you use that word intention, doing it with intention or intentionality, and I hear that coming through, and I've seen that in your constant progression as an organization. Every year there was a focus, and you accomplished what you sought out to do because of that intentionality. And I love the focus for the future. I think pay transparency laws went into effect in New York during this little period of time that we have worked together, and you were intentional about what can we do, what pace can we do it at that makes it sustainable for the organization.
Yeah.
Okay, Shan. No, go ahead.
Oh, and I was going to say, just as a kudos to you, Allison, and I think you and your team have been really helpful too in the conversations we have with employees about that, so that we're all using the same language. We've had no, clutching of pearls about pay transparency yet. And I think a lot of that is some of that foundational work we've put in, so that we're all, on the same page.
Yeah, and I appreciate including the staff in the conversations and the basic educational foundation on what is pay transparency and what is a pay structure, just the education process. I think that will serve you well as you continue that body of work. So, okay, Shannon, so you look back now, it's New Year's Eve, because I know you're going to be thinking about this on New Year's Eve. Biggest lesson learned over the past, since the organization's inception, and that best piece of advice that you would give to someone who is in that startup stage?
Yeah. Well, first, try to avoid that stress of the chaotic first few years. It's going to be chaos. Something I would give piece of advice, and this is speaking as me as a person. I'm a person who likes discipline. I like rules. I had, 15 years of Catholic schooling that gave me a lot of structure along the way. But I also believe in flexibility and pivoting, and we've got to be able to roll with the punches. I think those first, I would say 3.5 to 4 years has been a lot of flexibility. I've been reflecting along with our HR consultant a little bit about how and when we start to introduce some discipline. That flexibility helps you a lot as the winds are changing. But I think that discipline will keep you going steady as you think about a future. So finding and striking that right balance between being reactive and then leaning into that core of this is who we are, this is what we believe in, and this is what we're committed to. So yeah, that's I don't know if that's a great lesson, but for me, it's always trying to say, Shannon, you're being too rigid in this. Or Shannon, you're being too flexible in this. Of having that sort of self-reflection and ability to look at yourself and make that call.
And I think that's really well said. I agree with you. I think that in any startup, and then certainly with what's happened in the world over the past few years while you're in startup mode, having that blend of flexibility and discipline, and it's going to ebb and flow depending on what's happening in the talent space or in the marketplace there. Well, any parting words or thoughts of advice or things to reflect on that you want to share with our listeners?
If I could do it again, not that I want to do it again, one thing I would suggest, and again, the pandemic was a big part of a distraction, but when I talked about those early years of all the moving parts and you're responding to them, to your point of intentionality, Allison, I would have liked to have carved out some time to start thinking about some of those strategic big picture pieces. What kind of organization we are? What are we thinking for pay structure? Because as I reflect, I think back on things that cause me stress, and I think sometimes where there's a vacuum, where you haven't articulated something, people fill it. And then I think that leads to conflict because you've got to walk that back and you've got to, explain why it's going to be this way and not that way. So I always was saying, we'll get there, we'll get there, we'll get there on performance management. You don't really need to do it when there's only 5 of you. I think you do. So that would be one big takeaway of not waiting for all of those pieces to start thinking about that. It doesn't have to be your whole week, your whole month, but just to carve out, maybe one of your meetings in HR a month will be focused on that big picture rather than setting up benefits or retirement plans, etc. Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in the whirlwind of what needs to be done now, today. And I hear you, being able to pause and carve out whatever little bit of time to give yourself as a leader and your leadership team time to really think through the longer term plans is important. Well, Shannon Lucas, thank you so much for being our guest on Hold On, Let Me Close My Door. I'm sure that people listening to this episode will walk away with some things to think about in how they can, regardless of where their organization is in its life cycle, things to think about as a leader and things to think about in how you continue to build trust and culture and keep a team engaged.
Wow.
So I hope
Yeah.
I'm sure we will be talking soon. And to all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope to see you next time.
Okay. Thank you.